Hello and welcome to the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press, the podcast that brings you advice and conversation from authors, teachers and academics. I'm hosting today's episode. My name is Laura Kahwati and I'm the Education Manager for Thought Leadership at Cambridge Assessment International Education. In this episode, I will be joined by Dr Simon Ellis, who will be sharing his knowledge about behaviour for learning. Dr Simon Ellis works as a freelance educational consultant, providing training and consultancy support to schools and other settings on behaviour for learning. Prior to this, he was a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Education at Canterbury Christ Church University, where he taught on the Masters in Education programme and the National Award for Special Educational Needs Coordination course. He also contributed regularly to a range of the university's teacher education programmes, and his doctoral thesis focused on the development of beginning teachers' thinking and practice in relation to pupil behaviour. Simon has co-authored 3 books on behaviour for learning in 2009, 2015 and 2018. He has previously worked as a Key Stage 3 National Strategy Behaviour and Attendance Consultant and a Local Authority Behaviour Support Service Specialist, teacher and manager. He originally trained and taught as a primary teacher and has experience of working as a Special Educational Needs Coordinator. So, welcome, Dr Simon Ellis.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining me today. That's quite a biography of experience. I hope you don't mind me starting with a bit of an icebreaker. So before we talk about behaviour for learning, I'm interested because I was a teacher myself for many years, and I'd like to know, what was your behaviour like when you were at school?
I think probably as a child I was quite a shy, introverted individual, particularly in primary school. And I would say that probably characterised me through much of my secondary school career. I didn't get into any particular trouble in school. I wasn't disrupted if I didn't misbehave. I guess in the current educational situation, teachers might have had some concern about the emotional side of my learning, in the sense that, as I say, I was quite shy and quite introverted. But no, nothing spectacular on the behaviour front by any means.
No, no frequent detentions?
No, nothing like that. I don't think I ever got a detention, to be honest.
No. Well, it's interesting to describe yourself as sort of shy and introverted, and then I guess, but now you're starring in a podcast,
yes.
So we've come a long way. But actually, it's interesting to think about behaviour and the different types of behaviours that students exhibit. Alongside the author Janet Todd, you co-authored the book Behaviour for Learning, Promoting Positive Relationships in the Classroom. And I just want to ask you a little bit about the title of the book, Behaviour for Learning, and the term itself and why it's important. So, for instance, why is it different to a term like behaviour management?
Behaviour management, I think it's important to say that in adopting this behaviour for learning perspective, we're not saying behaviour management is unimportant or there's not a set of skills that teachers can learn to improve their interactions with pupils when problematic behaviour occurs. But as a term, the difficulty with behaviour management is its success criteria is very much wrapped up in its title. So in other words, how do you know you're successful in behaviour management? You've managed behaviour. Well, that's quite a closed loop in a sense. The outcome is behaviour is managed. What we're saying through Behaviour for Learning is that as an aim in itself is insufficient. The purpose of your behaviour management should be the promotion of positive learning behaviours. So we're trying to get teachers to think about, through their approaches to behaviour management, how are they promoting learning behaviour? So in other words, not just stopping at the level of, okay, that strategy managed to stop unwanted behaviour, because there's probably quite a lot of strategies that we could use to just stop unwanted behaviour. But the question we would have to ask is, what impact does that have on the child? For example, we could, hopefully teachers don't do this very often, but they could use fairly heavy put-downs to suppress a child's behaviour, using very kind of negative language about the child, or possibly putting the child in a position where they feel embarrassed in front of their peers. That may well have the effect of stopping the behaviour, but we'd have to say to ourselves, well, actually, what's the impact on that child's learning of that? The impact on the child's learning if the teacher uses that kind of strategy? As I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, how does that strategy impact on the child emotionally? How does it impact on that child in terms of their enthusiasm and engagement with the curriculum subject that particular is teaching? How does it impact on that child's relationship with the teacher? So the focus in Behaviour for Learning is far more about the effect of our strategies, how these strategies are experienced and interpreted by the child, whereas behaviour management often is construed simply with how do I control disruptive and unruly pupils. So I guess that's part of an answer to this. The other distinctive feature of Behaviour for Learning is it is based on a particular conceptual framework that emerged from a systematic literature review. And, if somebody said to me, well, okay, what is a defining feature of Behaviour for Learning? It is the fact that it's based on a conceptual framework that emerged from a systematic literature review, and it's based on explicit awareness of social, emotional and cognitive or curricular factors that contribute to a child's behaviour.
And actually, that's what I wanted us to go on to talk about, because, like you say, if we change the term from behaviour management to behaviour for learning, we're changing the person who benefits, really. Of course, a teacher benefits from having excellent behaviour management, and you can do that in many strict and unhelpful ways. But actually, if the focus is on behaviour for learning, then it's the learner and the child who actually is benefiting. And I want to ask you about the conceptual framework that the term behaviour for learning is actually based around. So what is the conceptual framework for behaviour for learning?
As I said, the Behaviour for Learning conceptual framework developed from a systematic literature review conducted by Janet Todd and Sasha Powell at Canterbury Christ Church University in 2004. And that literature review put forward a conceptual framework. Now, at the centre of the conceptual framework is learning behaviour, the idea that there are certain behaviours we want to promote and develop in all our learners. The conceptual framework is underpinned by the view that the development of learning behaviour is affected by an emotional domain, a social domain and a cognitive or curricular domain. Now, in the model, we refer to those areas, those domains, as relationships. So the emotional domain we talk about as relationship with self. The social domain we talk about as relationship with others, and the cognitive or curricular domain we talk about as relationship with the curriculum. So what the framework is really saying is, if we want to develop learning behaviour, we need to pay attention to those three areas, those three relationship areas. And we're thinking to ourselves, what is the child bringing to that relationship? In other words, in simple terms, what's the child like emotionally? What's their self-esteem like? What's their resilience like? That sort of thing. In relation to the relationship with the curriculum, we're thinking, what learning skills does this child bring to the task that I'm asking them to undertake at the moment? What's their learning organisation like? Do they, for example, have the ability to self-start on a task? Do they understand when they've reached the end of a task, for example? Do they know what to do when they're stuck? Self-help strategies to tackle the task, that sort of thing. All those sorts of things would reside in that relationship with the curriculum area. And relationship with others, we might talk about this in terms of social skills. It's that kind of interpersonal area. So the child's ability to cooperate and collaborate in a group activity, but also the ability to filter out distractions, social distractions, when they're required to work independently on a task. So these, in a sense, represent variables that the teacher can positively manipulate through their practice. The teacher can do things from their side of the relationship. The teacher can do things from their side of the relationship in order to impact on the child. So if the child is for example, bring into the situation a fairly vulnerable, fragile relationship with self. We might talk about a child with low self-esteem. The teacher can think about how they relate to that child, the sorts of strategies and approaches they use in that situation based on their hypothesis, if you like, that the child's difficulties in learning result from weakness in relationship with self. But I wouldn't want to say that we're only interested here with children who have difficulties or problems. These three relationships and the development of learning behaviour are important to all learners, children and adults, and as I'm sure we'll go on to talk about a bit later, also in relation to the teacher themselves.
So actually, in terms of thinking about behaviour for learning, whether it's adults or children, all of us come with these three relationships that we have. We have our relationship with ourselves, we have the relationship with others around us, and we have our relationship with the learning and the curriculum. And like you say, all of those interlink with each other and they can affect behaviour for learning, but they also allow the teacher to have a positive impact if we acknowledge those three relationships. So actually, I want to ask you, especially on behalf of many teachers who will be listening to this podcast, some of whom all around the world, if we just take one of those relationships to start with, the relationship with curriculum, if a child or learner is struggling with their relationship with the curriculum, what might that sound like or look like? How can we detect that that's what's going on?
I think for a child who's exhibiting difficulties in this area, the starting point is looking at what we're asking them to do. Actually, are we asking them to do something that they currently have the learning behaviours in order to be able to engage with that? So is the child developmentally ready to undertake this task? Have they got the learning skills to undertake the task that we're asking them to do? It might be something like their ability to sustain attention on the task for that length of time. It might be something like the ability to self-start on a task. Do they know how you go about starting this activity that you've asked them to do? The reasons why a child might be having difficulties in this area are many and varied. And part of the interlinked nature of the three relationships is we also need to start asking questions about the other two relationships, particularly relationship with self. So is what's manifesting itself as a problem with relationship with curriculum, they're not engaging with the task in some way, they're not prepared to tackle it, or they give up on it partway through, those sorts of things. Is that due really to difficulties with relationship with self? So you might have a child with low self-esteem who, to protect their low self-esteem, it's easier to mess about in class and get exited from the lesson, or just simply draw the teacher's attention for that, rather than tackling a task that you're afraid you're going to fail at and you're going to have to deal with the feelings of, I didn't get that quite right, and the impact of that on your already fragile self-esteem. Or it might be you're not engaging with the curriculum task because maybe to mess around in class builds esteem, is a way of belonging to your peer group. So actually, for want of a better phrase, being the class clown, getting laughed at, is a way of belonging to the class group because you haven't got a more positive way of belonging. Belonging in this way kind of works for you. So, we focus on relationship with curriculum. We ask those relevant questions. Can they do the task? Do they understand the relevance of the task? Have they got the skills? As I said, things like knowing what to do when you're stuck, those sorts of things, but not neglecting the difficulties may manifest themselves there, but may be attributed to one of the other relationship areas. And that, I think, is the beauty of the model. If people who are considering using this to underpin their practice can grasp that fluidity of it, that we're working around these relationships, we're always hypothesising, is the area of problem, difficulty in relationship with the curriculum area? We ask them questions about that, but we're open to the possibility that where the problems manifest themselves may be down to a difficulty in one of the other relationship areas. So it's giving teachers a tool to structure their professional thinking about the child in front of them.
Yes, because actually, if you are a teacher in a situation where you feel as though there is not behaviour for learning going on positively in your lesson, and there might be negative behaviour and poor behaviour, it's really helpful to think to yourself, actually, there are 3 key areas that I can look at now. Either this is a problem with this child's relationship with the curriculum, either it's a problem with the relationship with others that they have, or it could be that child or that learner's relationship with themselves. And as a former teacher myself, I know there will have been many times that I will have seen poor behaviour and I will have attributed that to something other than the actual task in front of that child or that student. Whereas actually, if I sat down with them and looked at what I was asking them to do and checked that everything, all the instructions were something that they could access and they could feel confident with and they could self-start with, that would change the behaviour as well.
And I think that's an important point, that almost a defining feature of being a teacher is your knowledge, skills and understanding of curriculum and pedagogy. And as a rule of thumb, that's always a good starting point. If you've got a child who's exhibiting difficulties, ask that question first. Is there anything I can do in that area of my prime professional expertise to bring about improvements? Now, the answer to that may be, I've done what I can here. I perhaps do need to look at what I can do to the other relationship areas. But always as a teacher, ask yourself questions about relationship with the curriculum, because that is a defining feature of a teacher. You have knowledge, skills and understanding in relation to curriculum and pedagogy, because you're not a social worker, you're not a youth worker, you're not a therapist, although you do as a teacher need to develop kind of skills and strategies broadly in those sorts of social and emotional areas. First and foremost, your expertise is in relation to curriculum and pedagogy, and it makes sense to start asking questions there first in terms of, can you make a positive impact on the child?
It's important to remember that, because teachers are such skilled and experienced and knowledgeable professionals. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that a fantastic teacher is somebody who just controls the class and has excellent behaviour management. But actually, teacher skills go far beyond that into a deep understanding of the curriculum.
And really, that's one of the things that we were also trying to promote through this terminology of behaviour for learning and learning behaviour, a stronger connection between learning and behaviour. Because another feature associated with the term behaviour management is it almost constructs the idea that this is a very distinct set of skills that is separate from learning. And many experienced teachers will say, actually, how I teach the lesson, the nature of the curriculum, that's one of the most important influences actually on behaviour. It's not the strategies I have for when behaviour becomes problematic, or not actually even the strategies I have to respond to positive behaviour in terms of praise and reward. It's the subject that I'm teaching, how I teach it, the activities I get the children to do, how I establish with the children the purpose and relevance of these activities. That's what sustains the positive behaviour. And the problem, in a sense, with this narrow focus on behaviour management is it can create the impression that it is this distinct area of activity. And certainly, as it's expressed in one very popular book on behaviour management, if you can get that right, then you're free to do what you're meant to do, which is, of course, to teach. And in a sense, we understand the sentiment, but it represents a separation. It's almost get that behaviour management right, then you can more or less teach anything and you'll be okay. Well, actually, what you're teaching is one of the powerful influences that leads to better behaviour in your classroom.
And any sense of any really poor behaviour may well be down to the task and the lesson itself. And that actually might be easier to fix than the behaviour going wrong during the lesson.
And I think that's a critical point, that kind of outlook on it, that by looking at and recognising it's something about how I'm teaching this lesson, how I'm doing it, that may be a factor influencing this problematic behaviour. It's not about teachers beating themselves up, taking the blame. It's part of reflective practice, is saying, actually, there is learning in that for me. Can I look at what I'm doing? Because far from this being something that you're taking blame for, this is you saying, I can look at this, and this is an area within my control, my influence. I can do something about that. You can't expect to control every other individual's behaviour, but you can change your own, and it might be by changing something about your own behaviour, your own teaching approach, your own way you speak to this child and interact with them, that will actually then have the positive effect on their behaviour. And that's so different from just looking for, okay, what's a good behaviour management strategy I can use when that child's misbehaving? It's a very different mindset the teacher would be bringing to the learning situation.
And it also reminds us that it's not only learners and children that have these three relationships that they are navigating all of the time and need support with, but actually all of us have these three relationships in many circumstances. We've talked a lot about the behaviour for learning relationship with the curriculum. I want to talk a little bit more about the relationship with others that children and learners are bringing into the classroom, how that might impact their learning and how teachers can support them with that.
Another point I think I'd want to stress about behaviour for learning and the conceptual framework and the three relationships is, in a way, it harnesses things that teachers will already be familiar with and already working on. It just helps you to have a more explicit focus on what you're doing and for what purpose. So relationship with others, teachers will often talk about this in terms of social skills, and they may well have children that they include in social skills groups where they feel that children have difficulties in this area. So when we're talking about relationship with others, it's very much in that kind of domain. So this may be children who, as I was describing myself in my own school days, very introverted and shy. That's a particular kind of relationship with others that hopefully my teachers at the time would work with to try to develop. So teachers will have pupils like that in their classroom. They will have other children in their classroom whose relationship with others is based on dominance and aggression, those sorts of behaviours. So the social behaviours children exhibit in the classroom will be many and varied. And by using this term relationship with others, it just encourages teachers to think about, where am I focusing my efforts? If I see difficulties in terms of relationship with others, what strategies and approaches can I draw on to support the development of that area? So like take my case, the shy introverted pupil back all those many, many years ago. What could my teacher have done to bring me out of that? And I can remember one very influential teacher that I had in what we would call Year 5 now in the UK. That would put me about the age of a 10-year-old. He had this system of lecturettes where you gave a talk to the class on a subject that was of interest to you, which in my case was anything related to World War II at that time. But in a way, that was kind of counterintuitive. The idea that this shy introvert person would want to then talk to a whole class about World War II. But the point for me of that was this was something I could prepare for. It wasn't the spontaneity of a social situation. I could prepare for that. So I would stand up at the class with my little pointer to point to posters and things that I'd brought in. And I would look back on that as quite a significant event in my upbringing, that my kind of relationship with others developed in a way, my kind of confidence in that area through the opportunity to do this. But how teachers develop children's relationship with others will depend on the learner and what the relationship with others is currently like. If it is the child who reacts aggressively to peers, we may well be working on self-regulation strategies. So actually ways that the child can recognise when they're getting angry, emotionally aroused, strategies they can employ at that point. We may be going down more of a kind of cognitive behavioural line, that we're trying to encourage the child to appraise situations, social situations, differently, so that this doesn't then lead to aggressive actions. So the whole variety of ways that you might work on this, as always with the Behaviour for Learning approach, it is very much on trying to work out what's going on for the learner in front of you in this area, and that will lead you towards the strategies to use.
Well, that's why the framework is so helpful, because there is no one-size-fits-all to behaviour for learning or behaviour management or teaching and learning. But if we think about our learners individually in terms of their three relationships, then we can cater to what it is that they need. If we can see that it's very clear it's their relationship with this curriculum they are struggling with, we can put those things in place. If it's very clear that it's their relationship with others, like you say, they might be really shy and introverted and struggle to speak in front of the class, and they need that extra support like your teacher had done for you when you were at school. Or they might be someone who is quite loud and dominant and perhaps disrupts the lesson, and they need support in a different way. This actually brings me on to what has been a thread through all of what you're saying, is about these individual learners and their relationship with themselves. So having spoken about the relationship with the curriculum and the relationship with others, what can you tell us about a learner's relationship with themselves? And is it the case that perhaps the relationship with self, as it's called, is the most important, or at least the most unique of the three relationships we've been talking about?
Well, again, I just want to emphasise this idea of the conceptual framework as a way of kind of harnessing what people do already very often in schools, but being very explicit about what the focus is. So relationship with self, we will often talk about this in terms of the child's mental health, self-esteem, resilience and so on, terms that are probably very familiar to teachers. And you're right in the sense that this is the most important relationship because it's the one that you carry everywhere with you. In a sense, you could argue relationship with the curriculum may change depending on the nature of the curriculum area. Relationship with others may change depending on the peers you're with, who your teacher is, and so on. But relationship with self, you carry around everywhere with you, and it will impact on the other two relationships. So it is very much that emotional domain, that kind of psychological level. And very often, when we see a child with quite entrenched difficulties, it will be relationship with self that we look at. And it's perhaps at this point bringing this kind of distinction when we're talking about learning behaviours between a kind of will and skill, if you like. So if we are talking about relationship with the curriculum, going back to that, are we sure the reason the child is having difficulties is because they don't know how to tackle the activity? That's kind of a skill issue, and the implication there is perhaps they've missed out on prior learning on this. We could teach them, we could develop that skill. But if the reason they're not relating to the curriculum in the way that we're expecting is down to a will issue, in other words, they've got the learning behaviours in their repertoire, they know how to do them, but for one reason or another they're not exhibiting them, then that might say to us this is more of a will issue. At some level, I'm not even suggesting conscious level, they're making some kind of choice not to employ those learning behaviours. That might point towards this being more of a relationship with self issue. For one reason or another, it makes more sense to that child not to engage with the activity in the way that we expect them to. Or similarly, not to relate to others in the way that we expect them to. It could be coming back to relationship with self. But say it is the one that's about resilience, self-esteem. I suppose we might say intrapersonal skills, if you like. And it is to say the importance of it is it's the one you carry everywhere with you to every situation that you're in, and therefore potentially affects your responses in other situations. So it's a hard one to work with because it's the one that's probably been shaped over quite an extended period of time from the various life experiences you've had, the kind of feedback explicitly and implicitly that you've had from others around you, whether that's parents, peers, teachers, and so on. So yes, it is perhaps the most important, and it does relate to that emotional domain.
I find it really powerful when you describe the relationship with self as the one that we carry everywhere with us all of the time. And it reminds me that actually sitting here with you today, I am carrying my own relationship with myself. You've got your relationship with yourself, and it affects the way that we interact with others, and it affects our levels of resilience and confidence and all the social and emotional aspects of our lives. And it makes me wonder, this behaviour for learning conceptual framework is perhaps something that goes way beyond the classroom and the teaching and learning level.
Yes, and I think we could relate it to many situations, particularly situations involving learning, and certainly to adult learners as well. So yes, I mean, that's an interesting starting point. You're talking about what we're bringing to this situation right now, because we've both got a relationship with the curriculum that is pretty good, I think, because you're interested in asking questions about this. I've written books on it and so on. So our relationship with the curriculum is probably very good here. We've probably got the kind of learning behaviours in the area of relationship with others that allows us to handle this situation. We know the conventions of this situation, and when we speak and when we be quiet, and the kind of unusual situation of having microphones in front of us and so on. It's not like a standard interaction, but we've got the skills to deal with that. And as you say, relationship with self, we're bringing that to it as well. We don't know each other that well, so we don't know much about our individual relationship with self. But what we could consider is, almost regardless of what our relationship with self is like here, because we've got a strong relationship with the curriculum, because we've got the skills in terms of relationship with others, in a sense, that might support some weaknesses in relationship with self. I'm not talking about chronic low self-esteem or something like that, but that general level of a slight lack of confidence, some nervousness about the situation. Because we feel we've got quite a good relationship with the curriculum, we kind of feel that we know the subject matter, if you like. We've got the skills to relate to each other. We've got at least a level of confidence in this situation that you're prepared to sit in this room and ask me questions and respond to my answers spontaneously. I'm prepared to sit here and answer questions from you and respond to your supplementary questions as well. I don't know what they're going to be necessarily. I can deal with that, even though we may both have a certain amount of anxiety or lack of confidence about this situation we're in. The other two relationships, in a sense, carry us through. But yes, I think it does relate to any learning situation. So yes, we can think about this as adult learners. And I think it's also important to think about how this relates to the teacher. We talk a lot about the child in response to the Behaviour for Learning conceptual framework. But the teacher has a relationship with the curriculum, which we can think about in terms of their knowledge of curriculum and pedagogy, the teaching styles that they have at their disposal, their ability to make the task seem relevant and motivating. A whole load of skills in that area. That's the kind of key area of the teacher's expertise, if you like. But the teacher also has skills in terms of relationship with others, their ability to form relationships with children and young people, particularly children and young people who sometimes it's difficult to form positive relationships with others with. So that's very much that interpersonal domain. And then the teacher's relationship with self. And that's an interesting one because, yes, we think about the teacher's self-esteem there, but we also think about the teacher's resilience. So how does the teacher cope if they experience misbehaviour in their classroom? We can also think about notions of teacher identity in there. I mean, I referred back to a teacher from my own school days who made quite a difference to me. I guess part of that would shape my identity of what a good teacher is. But I reckon if you ask many members of the public what makes a good teacher, they'd say, oh, it's somebody who can control their class. Now, if you're carrying that with you as part of your relationship with self, part of your identity you're bringing into the classroom, I would argue that's going to affect your response when you encounter misbehaviour. Because when you encounter the individual who you can't control their behaviour, because this child is bringing all manner of things to this situation that's influencing their behaviour, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that kind of conflict with your identity as a teacher, that part of your identity as a teacher is being able to control behaviour, and here's this individual where you can't? There's something about being able to cope with that. Because I suggest if you can't cope with that, it may provoke from you as the adult some quite unhelpful responses. It may lead you into responses that actually escalate the situation because you're trying to be that firm teacher who can control any other person's behaviour. And there is another side to this. I'm sure we've all seen films with the inspirational teacher depicted, whether that's something like Goodbye Mr. Chips or Dangerous Minds or Dead Poets Society, something like that. You've got this inspirational teacher who goes in with these children who are coming from troubled backgrounds, are disaffected, and just by that kind of almost charismatic cult of personality, the teacher manages to turn that class around and they're all very appreciative. I mean, it's played out in the film To Sir With Love, with Lulu, I think, singing a song to the teacher at the end. But what do you do if that's your image? You know, I'm the charismatic teacher who's going to be able to turn this class around, and actually you find it's Easter and you're still struggling with this class. How do you actually deal with that? So there's something about that relationship with self for the teacher that's important. So yes, I would think this model does apply to adult learners, and it is important. We're talking about relationships for learning. The teacher is bringing something to relationships for learning. The teacher has a relationship with the curriculum. The teacher has a relationship with others. The teacher has a relationship with self. And that is meeting with what the child is bringing to the situation in terms of their relationship with the curriculum, their relationship with others, their relationship with self. So it's very important to think about that teacher's triangle, if you like, those three areas.
I think we can all, well, many of us who have been teachers or are teachers can all empathise with that optimistic dream as you start teaching, that you may well be like one of those teacher heroes in the major films. And actually that puts quite a lot of pressure on a teacher. And in fact, perhaps one of the most helpful things would be to understand that we have got our own three relationships as a teacher, as our identity, that we are trying to navigate as well. And in terms of how teachers navigate those relationships for themselves in order to understand the three relationships better for their learners, I just want to ask you one last thing, which is, what would your best piece of advice be for a teacher who is going into a classroom tomorrow morning with a group of students that they want to promote behaviour for learning as best they can?
I mean, in a sense, that's the hardest question of the lot, because behaviour for learning is, first and foremost, a way of thinking about behaviour. It's a particular mindset, if you like. So it's really thinking about what you do in the classroom and relating that back to the principle that you protect and enhance the three relationships and you promote learning behaviour, and you avoid doing anything that could conflict with or undermine those principles. So at a simple level, it's kind of do no harm principle, I guess. So you're thinking about how you talk to pupils, how you talk to the students in your classroom. So if you do need to correct a child in relation to their behaviour, how are you going to do that? So if we take a simple example of children who call out in class, we might say, don't call out. I mean, that's a simple enough response. If we're frustrated, don't call out. How many times do I have to tell you? Might be the temptation. Well, if we're coming at it from a behaviour for learning perspective, one simple thing we might do is try and turn that on its head and phrase it as positive correction. So we might say to a child, remember to put your hands up, thanks. Or remember our rule for asking for help. We would switch the phrasing round so that we're focusing on the behaviour, the learning behaviour that we do want to see. Now, that's a very simple example, of course, but it will be thinking in that way, trying to predict what are some of the common behaviours we encounter in a classroom that we know that we're going to need to respond to. What might we typically say? Don't call out. How can we turn that on its head and express it as positive correction? Remember our rule for asking for help. Remember to put your hand up, thanks. That kind of language, because what that language does is it conveys to the child what the required behaviour is in that context. That's just a very small, subtle shift. If we look at the other side of the coin, if you like, the positive reinforcement, the positive feedback. So if a child is doing what we would like them to do, one way of responding would be, excellent, well done, fantastic, what a star you are, all those sort of things. But what that lacks is any feedback for the child on what the behaviours are they're actually exhibiting that is gaining your attention as the teacher. So you might say to a child, oh, John, I can see you've got your equipment out ready to start. Now, there's very little evaluation in that comment. There's no well done, fantastic. What you're almost doing is providing a description, a commentary on the learning behaviour that child is exhibiting. They're able to self-start because they've got the equipment ready. So you could think about things like that. What are some of the things I see children doing well that do kind of fit in with my expectations? How can I give them some feedback on that describes what it is that they're doing, so they know that that's getting noticed and it is something that you'd like to see more of. And of course, other children within earshot of that also hear what some of those behaviours or some of those learning behaviours are we're looking for in the classroom. I certainly think the teacher is a powerful role model in the classroom. So the teacher thinking about how do they model positive relationship with others? And that is tied up with a point I've just made. How do they relate to individuals? You know, if the teacher is domineering, making heavy use of verbal put downs and things like that, what's that modelling about relationship with others? What impact is that potentially having on the child's relationship with self if they're made to feel small and embarrassed in front of their peers? So there's that kind of level. There's the kind of level of making use of characters in literature, historical figures, contemporary news items and so on, where the protagonist has exhibited positive learning behaviours. And that might be around resilience and resourcefulness. It might be about persevering in the face of adversity when things don't go right first time. You know, if we think of some of the great scientists who've worked on developing things, you know, looking at some of their failed efforts first, or perhaps when they were ridiculed for their initial ideas and so on, but they stuck with it and they're now recognised for the contribution that they made. We can kind of use these almost as metaphors, as vehicles for talking about what positive learning behaviours might be. When the teacher is setting the task or giving feedback on how the task is being undertaken, they can use language that directly references specific learning behaviours. So they can talk about the fact that it didn't go right first time, but people persevered, they tried a different approach, that they didn't give up at the first attempt, that they looked where the problems began and they worked out what they could do differently next time. If we're getting children to feedback in plenary sessions, well, they can feedback directly on the task, but maybe if it's a group task, they could feedback on some of the learning strategies, skills they used in tackling that task. So the children themselves might be saying, we tried this approach first, but it didn't work, so we tried this one. And then the teacher can be filling in the language for them. Okay, so you persevered then. You actually recognise that there was learning to be had from mistakes. So trying to convey the view that mistakes are not the end of the road, if you like. Actually, there's learning in errors, and you learn from those errors and you evolve what you do to try and achieve a more successful outcome. But I want to come back to the first point I made about it. It is a way of thinking. So I would want teachers, if you're thinking, how do they approach this tomorrow morning? Part of it is being more reflective on action. So when you're in there working with your class, reflecting on this thing that I'm doing, this strategy that I'm using, does that fit with the idea of protecting and enhancing the three relationships? Does it fit with the concept of promoting behaviour for learning, or does it carry a predictable risk to those things? And reflecting on action after you've completed the lesson, reflecting on what you did. Was there anything in the strategies and approaches you used, whether in relation to learning or behaviour, that potentially undermined or conflicted with those principles of promoting and enhancing the three relationships, promoting the development of learning behaviour? And we know that teachers will look to the internet, will look to books, and will look to advice from colleagues in terms of strategies to deal with behaviour, particularly if they encounter a child whose behaviour causes problems. And there's a level of reflection prior to action that you should be able to think to yourself, okay, this strategy that's been advised to me, does that have a potential to conflict with those three relationships, undermine the development of learning behaviour? If it does, that would be a reason to reject that particular strategy or approach. So it's more than saying there is this specific set of things you should do tomorrow morning. It's about a way of thinking. It's giving you a reference point. So it may not be doing something different, but it may be thinking about what you currently do differently, and that may cause you to do more of certain things and other things to exclude from your practice, because when you reflect on it against the reference point of the conceptual framework, you can see that it potentially conflicts with the three relationships or the promotion of learning behaviour.
I think if I reflect on my years of teaching, I definitely feel as though just a simple shift in my thinking will have had quite a transformative impact on the learning that occurred in my classroom, because, like you say, it's not immediately about a set of actions, and it's certainly not a set of rules that suits everybody, but just to bring to the forefront the fact that there are these three relationships going on, and to be explicit about talking about them amongst staff, and talking about them in the language that you use in the classroom.
And something we always say, and I perhaps haven't said it enough as we've talked through this, is children experience and interpret events in the classroom as individuals. And that's sometimes the problem with behaviour management. It kind of comes from the perspective of assuming if I've got the right set of strategies, I will be able to deal with this. It's very one-sided. Behaviour for learning at all levels is explicitly taking account of the fact that children as individuals interpret and experience classroom events as an individual. We could also, say, whole school behaviour policy, that's basically a policy designed for groups, but is experienced and interpreted by individuals. So it would be no surprise, for example, that some children will not respond as expected to a behaviour policy that's designed for all. The good news is often we can predict how most children will experience and interpret what we do in school. We can predict that most children will find positive feedback positive, but we also recognise there are some children who will reject praise for a variety of reasons. We also know that most children will probably experience similar things as sanctioning, so the teacher correcting your behaviour, or if it's a school with any kind of house points system, losing points or whatever, most children will experience that as a negative and see that as aversive. That's the kind of good news. That's how most children will respond and interpret that. But the behaviour for learning approach is being very explicit about this idea that you cannot guarantee that every individual will experience and interpret your strategies in the same way. So it's always about thinking, what does the learner bring to this situation in terms of the three relationships for learning and their current level of learning behaviours, the learning behaviours they currently have in their repertoire. So I hope from that you get an idea of how this fits with behaviour management, but importantly is quite different in its set of priorities and its evaluation criteria, success criteria. If we go back to where we started, behaviour management, the success criteria was behaviour was managed. Behaviour for learning, we don't just stop at the management of behaviour. We're saying how I manage behaviour. Did that support the development of positive learning behaviours? Did that protect and enhance, but at the very least not undermine the three relationships for learning?
Well, thank you very much, Dr Simon Ellis, for sharing your expertise and helping us all to understand the three key elements of behaviour for learning, those three relationships, how vital they are and how easily we can become more conscious of them in our thinking about teaching and learning. It feels like through the Behaviour for Learning framework, teachers everywhere can make a difference with learning, behaviour, the curriculum, and all of the relationships that occur in the classroom. I want to just ask you finally, if people want to find out more about you or what you do, where can they go?
Probably the best place to go is to get hold of a copy of the book, our 2018 book, Behaviour for Learning, Promoting Positive Relationships in the Classroom. We've written books before that, but the 2018 edition represented our thinking as it had developed to that point in print. And as an academic working in a university, of course, our thinking has developed over the years. It's developing still. But in terms of our kind of latest statement in print, that's the book to get hold of, the 2018 edition of our work.
Thank you. Please do also listen out for the recording of Dr Simon Ellis's keynote speech on Behaviour for Learning from the online Cambridge Schools Conference from March 2023. I'd also like to encourage listeners to look at the Cambridge International Education Briefs on learner wellbeing and promoting a positive school climate. Our shows have lots of useful links that we've discussed throughout the show, so please check them out. Don't forget to tell your friends about us and rate our show on whatever platform you're listening on. It really helps us to get in front of more teachers. Remember to follow us on Twitter at CUP Education and use the hashtag BrighterPod to get in touch. Thank you, Dr Simon Ellis. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.